Steampunk is a genre of retrofuturism based primarily around the Victorian and Edwardian eras, which is to say, a look at what the future might look like based on the technology of the time, inspired by authors of the period that did just that, such as Jules Verne. H. G. Wells, and Mary Shelley. A period of industrial and technological growth that included, but was not limited to, steam power. To suggest that steampunk vehicles are limited to steam-powered vehicles would be a mistake, but it is a good place to start. And by the time of Queen Victoria's coronation in 1838, the steam engine had been propelling vehicles for nearly 70 years. The first commercial successes were steamboats, turning major rivers and other large waterways into quick, efficient lines of transportation that previously required a significant amount of labor by both man and beast. Soon paddle wheelers would start to be replaced by more efficient stern wheelers, but by the Victorian era, the propeller had made the paddle wheel obsolete, although it was still used, and steamships were taking control of the oceans, where they would remain until the marine diesel took control after World War II. But what the Victorian era did give the steampunk ship was the ironclad and other armored ships, as well as the move to all-metal ships, for all applications, military and otherwise. On land, however, steam power was primarily used by trains, or locomotives. Steam locomotives started to gain popularity in the early 1800s, and would become the primary form of long-distance travel in many parts of the world into the 1950s, when they would start to be replaced by diesel-electric trains and commercial aircraft. But by the mid-1800s, road locomotives would start to gain popularity, also known as the traction engine, or tractor for short. Initially, steam engines functioned simply as labor devices, often moved by horses to work from a stationary position, using cables or belts or working as a pump. But soon the roles were reversed, and one could opt for a rein tractor, replacing the horse, but it steers and functions just like one, before becoming fully self-contained to resemble modern tractors, both as farm equipment and in commercial applications. Not just for heavy hauling either, but other types of tractors, such as the steam shovel or the steam roller, names that carried on long after they were no longer steam-powered. Then there was the steam omnibus, possibly appearing even earlier, but not as widely used. In a large city such as London, they were cheaper, faster, and more manageable than their horse-drawn counterparts. So naturally, by 1865, they were nearly taxed and regulated out of existence. But they would manage to make a comeback just before the end of the century and carry on into the 1920s. Although in the face of growing competition from electric and other technologies, manufacturers usually found them unprofitable, although building the occasional truck version for commercial use helped. Smaller personal steam cars, on the other hand, seems there was a market for those, and they would be quite popular going into the Edwardian era. Brands such as Locomobile and White would be top sellers with steam-powered cars at the turn of the century. After all, it was familiar technology by this point, although the smokestacks were mostly gone. The best known, and perhaps most copied, were those made by Stanley, best known as the Stanley Steamer, although also called the Flying Teapot. They started building cars in 1897, with regular production beginning in 1902, and carried on until 1924. Abner Doble produced what were considered the most sophisticated of steam cars from 1906 to 1931, cars that would even offer electric start. But the electric start would give the internal combustion engine the lead in technology, putting an end to the steam car, and even Doble had to transition to train engine development. Electric vehicles would also see big successes, with electric trams soon leading to electric cars, which at first seemed like they would be the dominant option, the future of transportation. fast, quiet, and simple to operate. If only they had better range and some kind of charging infrastructure, they may have survived the era. It's hard to believe now, but the internal combustion engine was the underdog of the time, the last to arrive, and seeming to have less going for it. But as the Edwardian era came to an end with World War I, the gasoline engine was king. And early ones were more steampunk than one might expect, with such things as tillers instead of steering wheels, flywheel starting on cars like the early Benz, and later the hand crank that would continue to exist through the 1960s, and the related kickstart that would last a bit longer. There were what would now be considered unusual body styles, such as the face-to-face vis-a-vis, or the more practical dos-a-dos, with back-to-back seating. And, of course, there were those backseat drivers. One early advantage of the internal combustion engine was space. More compact packaging allowed for motorized bicycles, or motorbikes, which would lead numerous bicycle companies to becoming car companies. Car history tends to focus on the motorized carriage, cars that would mostly evolve into what would be called high-wheelers. But high-wheelers tended to prosper more in rural settings, where the roads were worse, while bike makers would connect two bike frames together, with a seat and engine mounted in between, for a smaller, simpler, lighter, more manageable, city-friendly vehicle. The brass era pretty much coincided with the Edwardian era, with its shiny brass and copper brightwork and accessories, including oil-burning lamps and multiple large control levers. And let's not forget the stylish ball horns, as well as handcrafted wooden bodywork, often with exposed radiators that would be mounted underneath, or along the sides, or even behind the engine. And even once front and center became the norm, they would often be capped with a temperature gauge. While the big interior dial gauges would take a little longer to start showing up, usually with such useful information as the time. But even after the overall look became fairly standard, some cars were a bit less conformist, such as Franklin with their exposed rockers and valve springs. And of course, steampunk influences would carry on through the First World War and beyond, with common for the time designs such as the sportabout or the town car being popular alternative styles to the increasingly common touring car. Perhaps they are not always as creative as some of the modern artwork would suggest, but there is a real foundation that the steampunk fantasy was built around. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.